So Marvel just gave us a one-shot comic that basically gives us a different ending to Secret Wars 2015, where Spider-Man essentially dooms the world. It's pretty crazy. And as is the case when it comes to what-if stories, this one's initially presented to us by the Watcher, although honestly, the story kind of fills us in with everything that we need to know. And so what this does is this initially picks up on Earth 1610. So this is not the new Ultimate Universe, the OG, where Miles Morales and the original Ultimate Peter Parker and all those guys come from. And we pick up with Ben Urich. Now, the cool thing about Ben Urich in the original Ultimate Universe is that he was a reporter, as much the same way he is in the main Marvel Universe. But the cool thing about the original Ultimate Universe here is that he goes on to basically become editor-in-chief for the Daily Bugle, so basically taking over for J. Jonah Jameson. Now, this technically happened in the Ultimate Spider-Man Miles Morales original run with issue number 6. What had happened was that J. Jonah Jameson believed he had killed Norman Osborn, and effectively it was done in self-defense. Norman Osborn survived and then killed J. Jonah Jameson. The last phone call that he made was to Ben Urich. And so this is just the natural progression of that particular plot thread. But what ends up happening is that while Ben Urich is on the phone, Peter Parker from the main Marvel universe shows up here. And as soon as Ben Urich looks over and sees him, Peter says, "You're thinking of calling security, but you won't." And Ben asks, "What makes you say that?" And Peter just says, "Because it doesn't matter what your nameplate says. You're a reporter, and you're going to want to know how I broke the world." And Peter Parker looks terrible. He literally looks like he is dying. And Ben Urich is just like, "My God, kid, your face, right? I heard rumor you were back, but like, what's going on here?" And that's where Peter kind of splits the difference and explains things to a degree. So to offer this exposition here, for those of you guys who are not aware, the most recent Ultimate Universe that just ended, that's Earth 6160, right? That's the new one. That's not what we're talking about. This original Ultimate Universe, the first one, that's Earth 1610. That's where Peter's at right now. And we'll kind of make sense of all this as we get towards the end of the story. But in the original Ultimate Universe, Ultimate Spider-Man died, as most of you guys are probably aware. This laid the groundwork for Miles Morales to go on to become, the new Spider-Man. But it's important to understand that when the original Ultimate Spider-Man died, it was pretty huge. When Peter Parker died in the Ultimate Universe, it was significant, both on the publishing side, because Marvel had never really killed Spider-Man before, at least not in that kind of guaranteed that he's never coming back type of story. But the other thing was that within the Ultimate Universe itself, Peter Parker was a kid who just wasn't really prepared for the kind of life that he was living, right? Being a superhero on that level, facing off against the kind of threats he was facing off against. And for a lot of people, Captain America, so on and so forth, it was the idea that they could have intervened, they could have trained him, brought him into S.H.I.E.L.D., or done any number of things to make sure he was prepared, or simply stopped him from being a superhero, and it would have saved his life. And because of the effect that Peter in the Ultimate Universe had on virtually everybody within the Ultimate Universe, his death was catastrophic, right? It was massive. And so when Ben Urich talks about the idea of, "I heard you were back," what Peter's referencing is, of course, Miles Morales, that Miles Morales took over as Spider-Man following the death of the original Ultimate Peter Parker in this comic. And so that's where Ben Urich starts to pick up on the pieces and says, "You're not from here. You're from the other Earth, the one that we saw in the sky a few months ago. What happened to you?" And that's where Peter says, "I can't be entirely sure, right? But I think it all started with a pineapple roast pork bun." And I know it sounds crazy to say that, but bear with me here because there's method to the madness. He says, "I don't know how much you know, but for a hot minute, all that was left of the multiverse was a patchwork planet kit bashed together by my world's Doctor Doom. For all intents and purposes, he had made himself God, which was even more messed up than it sounds. Consequently, your world's Spider-Man and I were dispatched to uncover the source of his power. We found it. Owen Reese, the Molecule Man. I had a pineapple roast pork bun in my pocket, and he demolished that thing like he hadn't eaten for a month. And then, armies, chaos, war. It was the end, until somehow it wasn't. And Peter Parker woke up in the Ultimate Universe. He's greeted there by Miles Morales, and Peter Parker is talking about how they have to find a way to get Miles home, and Miles tells him, "I'm home, you're not home." right? This is not your world. So let's kind of fill in these gaps a little bit, especially if you didn't read Secret Wars 2015. I will say I do have a video. It's literally Marvel's Secret Wars simplified, and we'll link it down in the description and pin a comment for it. But the overall gist of this is most people are probably aware of, if only casually, when the incursions were happening, literally worlds crashing into one another, and the multiverse was coming to an end. Due to any number of factors, the number of universes whittled down pretty fast, to the point where the only two universes you had left were the original Ultimate Universe, Earth 1610, and the main Marvel Universe, Earth 616. They collided in a final incursion, and Doctor Doom, having taken this kind of last moment by channeling the power of the Beyonders through Molecule Man, had saved what he could. And that's why Battleworld was a patchwork of realities. He was grabbing a piece of this reality, that reality, that reality, and that reality, and just saving whatever he could get his hands on. What Peter's talking about here when he says that he and Miles found the source of Doom's power, it's exactly that. Right, that they realized that in Battleworld, right, as part of Secret Wars, Dr. Doom's power was actually coming directly from the Molecule Man, who basically was the gatekeeper for the power of the Beyonders. Now, the difference between what's happening here and what happened in Secret Wars 2015 is that in Secret Wars, Miles Morales had a cheeseburger, and Miles Morales gave the cheeseburger to Owen Reese, so that when everything was set back to normal by Reed Richards, when Owen Reese took the power of the Beyonders away from Doom and gave it to Reed Richards from the main Marvel Universe, that Miles Morales survived into the main Marvel Universe, and because of the fact that he had given Owen Reese a cheeseburger, Owen had brought his mother back. And that's how you end up with the current status quo that you have for Miles Morales in the main Marvel Universe. But again, because this is an alternate reality story and it's a what if, things just happen differently here. And so when Peter talks about the idea of armies and chaos and war, it's literally the war at the end of it all. It's essentially everybody turning on Doctor Doom at the end of Secret Wars 2015. But the way that Peter Parker talks about this, like suddenly I was awake and I was in a different place. This is actually how Secret Wars ended for most people, right? Unless you were Black Panther and you had taken one of the Infinity Stones and protected yourself from the cascading effect when Reed set everything back to normal so that you were one of the only people who remembered everything. For most individuals, they didn't even remember the incursions that happened, right? Things had just suddenly reset back to zero. But for Peter, he does. And so picking up in the Triskelion, right, the home base of the Ultimates, which you and I would call the Avengers, Peter ends up meeting with Nick Fury, right? And Fury says, Mr. Parker, I know that this is not what you want to hear, but I'm afraid sending you home will not be possible anytime soon. And Pete asked the question, right, what am I missing here? Mysterio's doohickey transported me here and back again without incident. If you need me to help reverse engineer that thing, and Susan Storm cuts him off. Now, she does talk about how Amadeus Cho from their universe had basically helped them to refine and expand on the technology. But what Peter Parker's referring to here, the device that got him to the Ultimate Universe originally, that was actually in a story called Spider-Man. So again, referencing the death of the original Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe, when Miles Morales became Spider-Man, within the Ultimate Universe, no one was really on board with it, right? Due to any number of factors. Nick Fury didn't like it, Captain America didn't like it, most people were not in support of it. And outside of those individuals who didn't support it because they felt that Miles was too inexperienced, other people didn't support it because they felt like he was taking over a mantle that didn't belong to him, that it was disrespectful to take over the mantle of Peter Parker. That part of the narrative was actually a reflection of the Ultimate Spider-Man fan base at the time, in the sense that there were a lot of people who did not like Miles Morales for any number of reasons. And when Brian Michael Bendis wrote Spider-Man 2, it was this Peter Parker from the main Marvel Universe crossing over into the Ultimate Universe and meeting Miles for the very first time. And basically Peter gives Miles his blessing and says, look, you're doing the best you can, right? You are as much a Spider-Man as anybody else. So it was basically Bendis telling the naysayers of Miles Morales, shut the hell up, he's not going anywhere. And they shut the hell up because they realized he wasn't going anywhere. And then eventually they learned to love him, to the point that if Marvel had actually killed off Miles Morales by the time Secret Wars 2015 came around, people would have been pissed. People would have been mad as hell. Right, so when the explanation is given by Susan that they have refined and expanded this technology, the question of Miles is, then what are we waiting for, right? I mean, if we have a better version of the portal that Peter originally used to get here the first time he showed up here, then let's just use that portal to send him back to his universe. And Nick Fury says, we destroyed it, right? And he says, the physical laws of our universe have been stretched like saltwater taffy these past couple of years. The Future Foundation tell me one more incursion or excursion and it could collapse this universe entirely. It's hanging on by a thread. And so he says, I made the call to destroy it, Parker, and I'm sorry about that. And so at that point, Peter turns to Susan and he says, where I come from, you and I are friends. Please tell me you can fix this. There are people who depend on me. And her response, I should really get back to work. And she races off. The reason being because there is a personal stake she has in all of this, which is Reed Richards. In the original Ultimate Universe, I think as most people are aware by now, but in case you're not, in the original Ultimate Universe, Reed Richards started off enough of a good guy, but as time progressed, he basically started to become a villain. He started to become a bad guy to the point that he became the Maker. And so while Susan Storm had systematically lost him over time and in fact essentially turned her back on him, for the most part, it seemed like she never really stopped loving him. But then once he became the Maker, it was Anakin Skywalker becoming Darth Vader. There was no way for her to bring him back, right? He was just essentially lost. By all standards of measurement, it felt like there was no way to save him. I know that Anakin Skywalker does get saved, but you guys understand the point that I'm making here. And so when Susan Storm takes off, Nick Fury has a sit down with Peter, and he says, I could use a man like you, Peter. I am not ashamed to admit it. And Peter says, I have seen your helicarrier fleet, Director Fury. You seem to have everything pretty well handled over here. And so at that point, Nick Fury says, do me a favor, right? Look out that window and tell me what you see, or rather, what you don't see. And that's where Peter looks out the window and Jersey City's gone. And that's when he kind of starts to fill us in with this monologue. He says, Fury told me it had been flattened by my universe's Galactus, that it's not my fault, but it sure felt like it was. And the reality is that it definitely wasn't. But Galactus showing up in the original Ultimate Universe was actually a really dope story. So that was a story called Cataclysm. It was cool as hell. I know there are a lot of people out there who didn't like it. I thought it was phenomenal. The idea behind it was that, as most of you guys know, there's a story called Age of Ultron. That was a story where Ultron from the future used the body of the Vision in the present day to just start spawning all these versions of Ultron that essentially wiped out all the superheroes, or most all the superheroes, and then took over the world. Age of Ultron was a phenomenal story when it came out, and it still holds up to this day, even if the movie didn't do it any favors. What ended up happening in that story was because Wolverine, not really being the sharpest tool in the shed, started abusing time travel to jump back and forth through time, and was warned, right? You cannot keep jumping back and forth through time. Time is a living organism. You will break it. That's exactly what happened. Time broke. And it created a kind of slingshot effect where Galactus was yanked out of the main Marvel universe and sent over to the original Ultimate Universe. And that's when Cataclysm happens. And so Peter Parker is getting all of this information, right? That Thor is currently trapped in the negative zone, that Steve Rogers is dead. And then he's shown the Children of Tomorrow storyline. And that was really when Reed Richards in the Ultimate Universe became the Maker. A lot of you guys who are familiar with the current Ultimate Universe in Marvel, you have what's called the City, literally this giant dome in Latveria. Well, there's a reason why Jonathan Hickman brought it back, because when Jonathan Hickman wrote the story where Reed Richards returns as the Maker, that's when he introduced the Children of Tomorrow. And that's when he introduced the City, right? And so that's kind of what you're seeing here. And this point, when he's shown Richards event number 2, right? Codename Children of Tomorrow. That is when Reed Richards shows back up as the Maker, opens the dome, and then all these superpowered beings emerge and all hell breaks loose in the Ultimate Universe. And then he's shown Ultimatum, which is arguably the most reviled story in the original Ultimate Universe. It just felt unnecessarily terrible. I mean, there are a lot of people who still hate that story to this day, but there were some cool things that come out of it. That giant tidal wave that you're seeing in this shot, this was actually part of the story where Magneto had gotten his hands on Thor's hammer, and by virtue of manipulating the tidal waves across the world, that he had unleashed hell, right? And quite literally started destroying coastal cities all over the place. So Magneto almost killed the world in that particular instance. What's also interesting here is Peter asked the question, what about mutants in your universe? And the response of Nick Fury, it's complicated. To be brutally honest, we've given them very little reason to work with us. Now, this is something to talk about here, because honestly, it's one of the coolest aspects of the original Ultimate Universe. So unlike the main Marvel Universe, where mutants came into existence because Celestials modified their genes, and over time, because humans just started populating more, the population grew, people spread to different corners of the world, and more mutants just started popping up. In the Ultimate Universe, the mutant population was actually artificially activated by humanity, which is to say, when Wolverine was taken and inducted into Weapon X, it was discovered that he had this gene and nobody knew what it did. When the gene was activated, his healing factor kicked in. And so what ended up happening is the activation process was synthesized, and then it was spread across the world. And that's how mutants started popping up in the Ultimate Universe. But again, very much like the main Marvel Universe, mutants are hated and feared, especially after the events of Ultimatum, right? Especially after that event. But because of how mutants have been historically treated by humanity, mutants hate the human race, and the human race hates mutants, right? The original Ultimate Universe and humanity's relationship with the mutant population, it was always only ever a hair's breadth away from just full-scale war between the two groups. And Ultimatum really kind of saw that come to fruition in a lot of ways. And so faced with all of this, Peter does the only thing he can do. He makes some measure of a life for himself within the Ultimate Universe. And he says, I couldn't be Spider-Man, right? That mantle was not mine to take up in this place. And so I became Scarlet Spider, agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. And so at that point, when he's on a mission, right, heading to a Hydra base, which isn't overly important here, Nick Fury chimes in and he says, once again, gentlemen, I remind you that Hydra is now in possession of Latvian tech. This is a decapitation strike intended to halt their efforts to regroup. Is that clear? Now, the question has to be asked, what happened to this universe's version of Doctor Doom? We'll talk about that. There's actually an explanation to it. But where Iron Man, Sam Wilson, and Spider-Man arrive on the scene, Nick Fury actually kind of tells Sam Wilson and Tony Stark, hey, keep an eye on Peter, because he looks like he's still, figuring himself out and figuring out what he's capable of. Now, you and I know that's a ridiculous statement to make. Spider-Man doesn't need help from anybody figuring out what he's capable of. And in fact, they kind of comment on that, right? Sam Wilson is just kind of like, look, Nick, this kid knows what he's doing, man. I don't think he really needs any help from us. Because while it is a different reality from the one that Peter's used to, at the end of the day, it is all still kind of the same thing, right? It's same bad guys, different names, different looks, but it's all the same thing. And so that's when Tony Stark busts in to Hydra headquarters and goes to face off against Kraken, who's just the leader of Hydra at that point in time. The problem with all of this is that when Peter arrives on the scene and Kraken literally has Iron Man, right, and is about to kill this guy, that suddenly a hand just punches through Kraken, and it's the Incredible Hulk in the Ultimate Universe who rips him in half. Now, original Ultimate Universe Hulk was brutal, right? In the main Marvel Universe, the Incredible Hulk just smashes stuff, right? And he'll do some brutal stuff from time to time, but like Banner, Ultimate Universe Banner, this guy was like a cannibal, right? It was nuts, right? How crazy this guy was. Now, him tearing Kraken in half like this is actually a reference to when he fought Wolverine and tore Wolverine in half in the original Ultimate Universe. But the fact is, in seeing this, right, in seeing how these guys operate, that they operate with just a total disregard for the lives of the villains they're facing off against, Peter can't handle it. And in fact, he says, while he's crying, this world is all upside down. I cannot stand it. Your Hulk just tore a human being in half like he was nothing. And that's where Stark is just like, you'll get used to it, right? Banner always accomplishes the mission, but he rarely ever does it politely. He'll do what he has to do, but people are going to die in the process. And the fact that this is just kind of the way things are, right? The fact that there's no real remorse, and the fact that it's just business as usual. But for Peter Parker, the fact that Tony Stark says it like this, the fact that it's like, yep, this is just kind of how things work, it's treated so casually, right? The deaths of people is just something treated in such a cavalier fashion that Peter is almost kind of broken by it all, right? The problem is that in the midst of all of this, he starts bleeding from the nose, and immediately Medvac is called in and he's whisked away. And that's when he meets with Banner, right? And Banner tells him, textbook aplastic anemia. It looks like our physical laws are finally catching up to you, right? And so he's just like, simply put, in the reality you come from, you were bitten by a radioactive spider and it gave you powers. But in this reality, A radioactive spider bite just gives you radiation sickness, right? That's really it. So quite literally, Peter's dying from radiation sickness. Now, for people who are inexperienced or haven't read the original Ultimate Spider-Man run, the question you're probably going to ask yourself is, wasn't the original Ultimate Universe Peter Parker bitten by a radioactive spider? And isn't that how he gained his powers? And if that's the case, then why is it suddenly that Peter Parker from the main Marvel Universe is dying here? Well, something to know is that when Peter Parker was bitten by the spider in the original Ultimate Universe, it was not a radioactive spider. It was actually an experimental spider that essentially infected him with a variant of the super soldier serum, because the original Ultimate Universe was always designed to be grounded in reality. And this is exactly how it would have played out, if Peter Parker had been bitten by a radioactive spider. So that's how Marvel gets around this. It's a pretty ingenious strategy, to be honest. I kind of like it. And so Peter asked the question, right? How long do I have? And Banner just tells him, well, before your insides turn into rotten soup, weeks, months, if the fates are cruel to you. And so Peter asks him, do you remember what it is that you do when you become the Hulk, right? The lives that you take and the damage that you do. And the response of Banner, oh yeah, definitely. Right? And then he just says, in any case, I'd get Fury to send you home sooner rather than later, right? With any kind of luck, the damage is reversible within your reality. So the fact that he's equally dismissive, which is true, right? It falls in line with the nature of Banner in the original Ultimate Universe. It just throws Peter off so bad, because in the main Marvel Universe, people don't work that way. The preservation of life, right? Traditional superhero archetypes, that governs everything that happens in the universe that Peter Parker's from. And so in hearing all of this from Banner, he just says, I can't go home, right? Like Nick Fury said that he destroyed the portal. And that's where Banner's just kind of like, is that what he told you? That's weird. Anyway, I have to get out of here. And so Peter's response is like, wait a minute, what do you mean that's what he told me? Like, what are you talking about, right? And like, he just like goes to chase after Banner. Now, Banner never does anything unintentionally. So when Banner says that, Banner was basically telling him, Nick Fury lied to you. He just wasn't doing it in so many words. But what's so crazy about this is that while Banner's walking away, Peter's suddenly met by Iceman, Miles Morales, Johnny Storm, and Kitty Pryde. Now, Kitty Pryde is of particular interest here because, again, in the original Ultimate Universe Spider-Man run, Peter Parker and Kitty Pryde were a thing, right? At one point, it was Peter Parker and MJ, and then Kitty Pryde and Iceman. But of course, their relationships ended. And so Peter and Kitty Pryde started getting together. And that's kind of the funny thing. That's why once everybody's greeting each other and they basically reveal, hey, we're here to get you out. Once we realize that Nick Fury had you here and there was a portal that could get you home, our goal is to get you to that portal. When the question's asked, right, what am I to all of you guys outside of Miles, because I know him, Kitty Pryde just says, Peter Parker's family. And that's really all you need to know. Now, please just trust us, follow our lead, and don't fall behind. Now, why it is that Kitty Pryde doesn't really talk about her romantic connection with basically that universe's version of Peter, I don't really know. Honestly, I feel like it would have been kind of a nice little touch for her to say, like, honestly, Peter and I were together as a couple. And in seeing you here, I know you're not him, but at the end of the day, I would do whatever it is that I had to do to help him, which means I will do whatever I have to do to help you, right? So I feel like that would have been a nice little touch to add into it. But regardless, of course, S.H.I.E.L.D. agents come running into this place and nobody really kills them. They just kind of freeze them or incapacitate them in some way. But then they end up where the portal is. And that's where you're met with Ben Grimm, Danny Ketch, and Susan Storm. I do want to point out here, with Danny Ketch, right, if you're familiar with this character in the main Marvel Universe, he's not Ghost Rider in the original Ultimate Universe. He's actually Machine Man. So the way his story worked was that at one point he was just an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., right, working for Nick Fury. During that story that we referenced earlier, the story of Cataclysm, where Galactus showed up in the main Marvel Universe, what ended up happening was that the main Marvel Universe version of Galactus merged with the Ultimate Universe version of Galactus, which was just a gigantic combination of effectively nanites. And so it created like this whole new version of Galactus. Eventually, that version of Galactus, the Ultimate Universe one, is essentially destroyed. And what ends up happening is that some of those nanites bond to Danny Ketch, and that's how he becomes Machine Man. So just consider him like a wildly futuristic robot, for lack of a better word. But when Peter gets in here and he sees the portal, he's 8 kinds of pissed off, right? But Susan Storm tells him, right, you don't understand, Peter, this is a window, not a doorway. And Ben Grimm tells Peter, right, we use it to keep tabs on him, right? We cannot go through this thing. He cannot know we're watching. And so that's where Ben Grimm turns into his Rocky form, and literally a fight breaks out between everybody. But the fight's just a distraction, right? All everybody is here to do, at least Miles and Johnny and Kitty Pryde and Iceman, is to buy Peter time so he can get to the portal and he can get through, which is exactly what happens. He steps right through this portal, and when that happens, on the other side waiting for him is the Maker, is Ultimate Reed Richards. And so a lot of you guys, in response to this, are going to ask the question, how does this tie into what's happening right now in Marvel Comics with like the new Ultimate Universe and all that kind of good stuff, and everything that we're seeing here? The reality is that because this is an alternate take on what would have happened with Secret Wars 2015, you kind of have to pretend as though nothing that we're seeing that's happened in Marvel Comics since Secret Wars 2015 ever happened. This is just an alternate take on all that stuff, right? And so that's why the Maker's here, because instead of the Maker's story transpiring the way that it did after Secret Wars 2015, this is what happens with him. And so when he's standing here in the remnants of Battleworld, he's got the Molecule Man in chains, and the Maker looking at Peter is just like, you're not one of mine, are you? And so that's when he looks at Owen and is like, what did you do? And Owen just says, right, he gave me a pineapple roast pork bun. I couldn't just let him get obliterated when everything's set back to normal. And so that's where you find out nothing's set back to normal, right? And so the Maker's like, well, you know, what's done is done. And so Peter Parker says, you shouldn't be here. You and Reed, my Reed, right? You both went missing on Doom's Earth in Battleworld. And the response to the Maker is, I mean, that's right, but a butterfly flapped its wings and now I'm God. And so Peter asks, well, what about my Reed Richards, the main Marvel Universe Reed Richards? And the Maker just says, oh, I killed Reed with a bubble of accelerated time, and then I killed Doom, and now I'm remaking the multiverse, except this time there's a plan. Now, we don't really get to see how the Maker killed either Reed or Doom. I mean, there is the whole sped up time bubble, but it still would have been kind of interesting to see. But the reality is we don't necessarily need to see it, because I think that the Maker is in the public consciousness enough within the general comic book fan base. Most people know enough about him to know that given how intelligent he is, he would have found a way to kill pretty much all of them if he could, right? So it makes sense. We don't actually have to see it go down. It just would have been dope, right? But the Maker tells Peter, right? He says, please stand back. You can do everything right, but some infant universes still won't make it past primordial nucleosynthesis. And so Peter asked the question, can you send me back to my universe? In response to the Maker, I'm sorry, but that's just not possible. It doesn't exist, right? Before I became God, my project, my vision was to basically make a perfect version of my world, but I was sculpting with mutinous clay. It would not accept the beautiful new shapes that I tried to impose on it. So now I don't improve. I iterate. Using my universe as a control variable, I create entirely new ones. And one day, one of them will be perfect. And on that day, I will rest. And so this is a pretty big revelation here, right? Because with the way the Secret Wars 2015 ended, when it was the main Marvel Universe version of Reed and all of them, what ended up happening is that the Molecule Man served as the source of power. Franklin Richards was the universal shaper. So he quite literally took the power of the Molecule Man and then created a singular universe out of it, populating it with life and sentient beings, all that kind of stuff. And then Reed Richards, guiding Franklin, restored each one of those universes to exactly how they were before Secret Wars 2015 happened, the incursions and Avengers and New Avengers and all that kind of stuff. And then because Reed knows everything, right, and remembers everything, when that universe was given to him by Franklin, Reed put it right back where it was supposed to be within the multiverse. But that's not what happened here, right? Instead, what the Maker's been doing is, because he cannot recreate every universe exactly as it was, which is most likely a limitation for him, that instead, he literally just took his original Ultimate Universe and made every single universe in the multiverse some variation of it. So in effect, every universe in the multiverse is based on the original Ultimate Universe in this particular what if scenario. And that's what he hits at here, because Peter Parker says, all these new realities and you will not remake mine. But the Maker actually says, right, as much as it pains me to admit it, I can't. right? Your world possessed qualities that I have consistently failed to replicate. Put simply, it cannot survive the presence of superhumans. And so Peter's like, but your universe. And the Maker just says, yes, I know, right? All that power concentrated in the hands of so few. I used to think power was the only way outside of the crisis, but it was the crisis all along. You mark my words. Right, that place is going to tear itself down to the studs someday, which is exactly what happens, right? In that fight back at the Triskelion, once Peter Parker had passed through the portal, Kitty Pryde had actually phased through Machine Man. And when that happened, his nanites self-detonated, and in that moment, blew the entire building apart. But back with Peter and the Maker tells him, right, if you want my advice, Mr. Parker, do not get too attached to that place. But I want to focus on this idea, right, when he says that Peter's world simply just couldn't survive superhumans. Something to keep in mind about the Maker is that when the Maker considers the creation of worlds, he thinks on a universal scale, right? He doesn't think in the moment. So it's not one of these things where he was just like, I tried to recreate your world, Peter, but every time I tried, the superheroes rebelled or something like that, and the world just destroyed itself in a matter of minutes. No. The argument he's making is essentially that your world, your reality, will succumb to the influence of superheroes. At some point in time, superhumans on your world will lead to that world's destruction. It's inevitable. There's no way to get around it. It could be in 1,000 years, it could be in 10,000 years or 50,000 years. But the Maker is approaching the recreation, or had approached the recreation of Peter's world from the perspective of, if I create this world, will it last on into infinity, or will it eventually be destroyed due to some internal or external factor that has nothing to do with like the sun expanding and consuming the world, or a meteor crashing into it, or something like that? Will it end due to the actions of superhumans? And that's what he's referring to, right? So technically, he did recreate Peter's world, and technically he could create it again and send Peter back there. It's just that the world wouldn't exist in a way that the Maker is accepting of. And so that's why he tells Peter, your world just doesn't exist anymore, because honestly, I couldn't make it into a perfect world based on my vision. And so once you jump back here to Ben Urich and Peter Parker telling this entire story as his hair's falling out, and he's literally dying of radiation sickness. Ben Urich talks about the explosion at the Triskelion, and Peter's like, no, I wasn't there. I only got there for the aftermath, right? They're saying that Machine Man's nanites self-destructed when Kitty phased through some kind of defense mechanism. 827 people were killed. Only Spider-Man, Susan Storm, and Kitty Pryde made it out. And so he says, I left the world without a shield. Ben, there is no organization protecting the world anymore from whatever threats may exist both in the world and outside of the world. And so he says, I have to make it right, but it can't be like it was before. Too much power in the hands of too few. And so Ben Urich's response is, but I don't have any powers, right? I'm literally just a reporter, right? I mean, you don't need me for something like this. And the response of Peter is, yes, we do, right? We need everybody now, and we need your platform, right? You run the Daily Bugle. You're the editor-in-chief. We need the Bugle to help us spread the world. And so at that point, Ben asked the question, who's we? And Peter says, a movement. Right? Regular people with vastly more power than they realize. Superhumans as well. We won't be around to keep you all out of trouble, but that's okay, because when Ben Urich finally gets to this underground bunker where this group is meeting, when the door opens, Storm's standing there. You can tell by her eyes and her skin tone that it's Storm. And she's like, you're the journalist. And he says, yes, right, my name is Ben. And Peter just says, as long as it's the good kind of trouble. And that's when Storm just says, come in, Ben, we're just getting started, because this is literally a movement to retake the world, and honestly, to eventually go to war with the Maker at some point in time. The irony behind this, and I'm going to go on a dangerous, I'm going to step out on a limb here. The irony behind this is what the new Ultimate Universe should have been. To be honest with you guys, in seeing this one shot, this is what the new Ultimate Universe should have been, to be quite frank. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.